everyone. Welcome back to Paths of Play. It's Valentina.
And Rory.
Today, we're going to be having a conversation around understanding the time commitment of high level youth soccer. When we were younger, we probably didn't actually realize the amount of hours that were put into our sports, including our family's time. So, we thought that that would be something useful to talk about because some families might not know what the time commitment might be realistically, especially if you have more than one athlete.
Yeah, it's definitely a good thing to know, especially when kind of getting to that stage in your athlete's life of where you kind of have to decide if they're going to take that next step. And to your point, my brother and I both playing pretty high level youth soccer was definitely a lot of time commitment for both of us and our parents.
Yeah. And speaking of time, the question of the day today, what is the longest that you had to drive for a game or a tournament that you remember?
I have a very clear one, and we probably didn't need to drive. We definitely could have flown, but for some reason, I don't know why we drove. I think I got invited last minute to this tournament, and so my parents asked some of the other parents on the team, like, "Hey, can Rory go with you guys?" And one family was driving down, so I got piled in with them. I remember the final destination was San Diego. Surf Cup. So we left at 5 a.m. and drove straight, no stops. The family I went with, the parents swapped drivers, and one of them drove through the night, and I'm pretty sure we got there 18 hours later.
So, Seattle to San Diego, straight drive, no stops whatsoever. Was that because you guys needed to make it in time, or was that just because you didn't want to spend additional time stopping and taking breaks? That's kind of intense.
Yeah, I don't actually really remember, like, the reason for it. I guess probably to not have to stay in a hotel or
Oh
something.
my
But
gosh.
yeah, it was 18 hours, and luckily, I slept in the back. Um,
Right, it's the parents that have,
yeah.
they get the short end of the stick. Well, that's definitely much longer. That's an additional 10 hours than my longest drive that I remember, which was from Arizona to New Mexico. I don't remember what part specifically of New Mexico, but it was around 8 hours, which felt really
I
long
mean,
to
yeah,
me.
that's still
Yeah.
a hefty drive.
Which I thought it was gonna be closer for some reason, but anyways, that's definitely one prime example of the hours that went into not only soccer, but also the travel piece, which is
Yeah.
an added time cost if you're considering high level youth soccer.
Thankfully, I flew back.
Okay,
So I didn't drive back. They drove back though, but yeah.
why did you get to fly back?
I'm I met up with my family somewhere else for a different soccer tournament, which my brother was at, which that's probably why they couldn't go with me to San Diego.
Okay, that makes sense. And you know what? This happens so much. We'll probably talk about this later. But I do remember there were many occasions for tournaments that I had to carpool with teammates or they carpooled with my family because parents just don't have the time always, I'd imagine. And I definitely personally didn't have that notion when I was younger. I just thought my parents were always supposed to be there for me.
Yeah. Oh, same here.
So I think just to set the stage a little bit, it would be helpful to talk a little bit about your own journey and how maybe you started playing different sports at first, which we know because you've shared in the past, and then how you slowly had to transition perhaps to specialize, or perhaps the reason you specialized in soccer was because of the time commitment. So I think just talking a little bit about the average hours per week and giving us a little bit better understanding for families out there who might not have any idea for what the time commitment might be.
Yeah, so when I started out playing after rec, so probably around age 9, I remember being on a team that my brother was on, and we would train twice a week and have games on the weekend. So thankfully for my parents, it was just the same team, so they didn't really have to worry about that. But that was probably twice a week, and practices were probably 20 to 30 minutes away. Being in Seattle, you kinda had to drive pretty far to a lot of practices. So that already was a pretty big time commitment, but I was still able to play other sports. But it was once I turned probably 11 and I moved up to the top I guess, division in the state of Washington, we started practicing 3 times a week with games on the weekend, and every single time the training was probably 30 minutes away. So that's an hour and a half training 3 times, and then an hour of driving 3 times, and then games on the weekend, which those could pretty much be anywhere in the state. They were usually within probably 30 minutes to an hour, but, I mean, that's still and you have to get there early for the game, probably an hour early to do warm-ups, and then the game's an hour and a half, then drive home. And so that was kind of league play, and then we would do 3 or 4 summer tournaments. Those were usually within Washington. Sometimes you would go to one in California, like Surf Cup, that I mentioned earlier. And then I would say that kinda stayed about the same until I got around 14 or 15 years old. Within the state and the league play, it kinda stayed the same, but then we started going to more tournaments like Surf Cup, regionals, National League. So these are things that are longer, kinda like week long, sometimes in the summer. National League was twice, once in the fall, once in the spring. And then once I got to 17 years old, so my last 2 years of high school, when I moved to an academy team, we would train 4 times a week and play twice on the weekends. So that was basically 6 days, and the trainings and games were at least 40 minutes away. So that was an even bigger time commitment, but luckily at that point, I was starting to be able to drive myself. But definitely for the first couple months, my parents had to drive me.
So, knowing that as the time increased when you got older, but naturally you became more independent, before that, how much would you say that you had to rely on your parents to take you to practices, to take you to tournaments? Were they always there? Were you having to fly with your parents if you did have to go on airplane trips?
Yes, definitely from U11 all the way up to probably U17. My parents basically had to be there helping out the entire time. We had 1 or 2 carpool buddies usually every year, so that would mean my parents would probably drive to practice once a week, 1 week, and then twice a week the next week. But then, yeah, for the games, they were always going to those. If they were out of town, maybe my grandma would get pulled in or something like that. But, yeah, and then any tournament where you have to fly, usually they would have to go to that as well.
Would all parents go to the flying trips or were there just chaperones?
When we were younger, most parents would go. Occasionally, if some parent couldn't go, then they would kinda get grouped in with another family. But definitely as we got older, and parents are more comfortable with their kids traveling with somebody else, then they wouldn't go as much, but definitely for the first few years, I would say majority of parents were going for sure.
And what if you remember, what do parents do while they're waiting during practices? Because sometimes, like you said, you have to drive 30 to 40 minutes out to your practice. So by the time, if you were to go somewhere else, by the time, say, you went back home, you'd have to drive all the way back, not to mention the gas expense of having to do that. And also just time wasted. So I'd imagine a lot of parents stay around. What do they do if they're waiting for their athlete to come out of practice or, during warm-ups, for example? I feel like during my games when we had to drive literally an hour just to get to the game, to be there an hour before the 90-minute game, my parents would find somewhere nearby to go have lunch or go and grab food or just go and find something nearby, which wasn't always the case in Arizona. But if there was something around, that would be something they would go do, or maybe sometimes they would just watch the warm ups. That just doesn't happen every single time.
Yeah, no, definitely, and because of how far our practices would be, my parents wouldn't have the time to go home because, like you're saying, they would have just gotten there, basically got back in the car and came back. So they would usually try and go find somewhere to, like I know my mom would sometimes do some extra work if
Yeah.
she had her computer with her. I don't know, sometimes watch some of the practice, at least, like, half of it, but, yeah, I mean, you have, like, an hour and a half to
Mm.
kill after you already drove half an hour there, and it's at night, so you can't really go to a coffee shop. There might be 1 or 2 that are open if you're lucky, but, yeah, it definitely wasn't ideal, and I this is just something I really didn't realize until more recently.
Right, yeah. I think when you're that young, you automatically assume that it's your parents' responsibility, and perhaps that they owe you that at the very least, but the reality is that that's not the case, and they're going out of their way to provide you with that experience of playing a sport, which obviously involves so much time and money. And I think that leads me to another thought that it's important when you're considering going into a higher level of youth sports, specifically soccer in our case. It's important to know that the club and the team that you might be considering should definitely align to your level of accessibility and how much time you're willing to commit because there are many clubs and teams out there that will definitely align with how much bandwidth you might have. So you don't have to give it all up if you're not conveniently located or you don't have the right support system that might be able to help you on a Wednesday when you don't have the time to take your athlete to practice. So I think this is definitely a theme that we talk about a lot is just considering your goals and the feasibility of your current state and making a decision on what and team and coach will fit your needs and accommodate for your needs the best.
Yeah, totally. I think being able to be happy with the club you're at because you're not overly stressed and you're not just completely using all your time having to kind of force even being able to show up to practice would definitely plays a huge factor in this.
Right, and you don't have to start in such a high level club or team right away, right? Like, you can definitely remain on a team that is conveniently located for you at the time because that might be your biggest priority then and there. And then eventually, maybe when your athlete can drive, if they have the option, that definitely is a huge, huge help in gaining access to other teams and other clubs that might be further away, right? Or maybe somebody else on that team has the ability to carpool with your athlete. So I think there's just different angles that you can consider. The important thing is to weigh your options thoughtfully so that you're not constrained for a long period of time or feeling stressed or there's pressure on your athlete because you're not able to show up to practices or strength trainings and consequently that ends up being just a stressful situation to be in because you do have to be prepared to commit whatever time is expected of you for the level that you're aiming for.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you bring up a good point there of having the ability to ease into it. I played with a bunch of people who maybe didn't have the ability to go travel around and get to practices at a young age and stayed on more regional teams. But then as they got older, rose up the ranks, and it was much easier once either they were able to drive or they were able to take the bus or the train to a friend who could then drive, or they could meet halfway and then it's just so much easier. So, yeah, not forcing it right away because it's just gonna cause so much stress.
Agree completely. And I think especially when your athlete might still be, fully dependent on you for transportation logistics, because I think that's probably one of the bigger time consuming areas of playing club sports and specifically youth soccer is the weekends that you have tournaments and California, I mean, we were going probably on a weekly basis. You leave school early on Friday and you drive 6 hours from Arizona, of course, to San Diego, let's say, and you're playing games all weekend. In between the games, your athlete's resting, they're eating. It's not really like your typical family vacation,
Right.
unless, of course, the time allows and it's a pretty entertaining spot. But for the most part, you're there for the sport itself, and it's all the whole trip's revolving around your athlete. And then come Sunday night, after probably your last game of the weekend, get back in the car, drive the 6 hours back home, get everything sorted out, and get prepped for the next day of work and rinse and repeat. So it definitely has to be something that everybody wants to do because it does become sort of a routine family activity. Which I will say, a lot of my fondest memories are from those trips. I might have not realized it at the time. When you're an athlete and in that space, you're very much just thinking about all the other factors and all the other things that are going on when it comes to a travel trip like that. But when you reminisce now, you're thinking of, oh, my parents would come with me and they would come watch the games. And even my parents now will talk to me about all of the road trips that we do and even the local ones. When we did play in Arizona, I mean, I would have to drive 45 minutes out
Right.
to the fields and you spend your entire day at the fields because it's just so far out there. You have to be there an hour before your game. And so I think now you look back and you are sort of nostalgic of all that family
Mhm.
time.
No, I definitely feel the same, and you remember those trips you take a lot, and those are just great memories all around. You bring up having to go to California all the time later in your youth soccer career. Kind of at what point did those tournaments in the league play, whether that be ECNL or whatever, at what point did those go from being just in the Phoenix area to all of Arizona to basically you're half living in California?
Once you are past the state league division sort of level of play, I think that's when you move on. If you do want to continue playing at higher levels, that at least for me was when I started to travel a little bit outside the state, a little bit more logically. And obviously, once we joined the ECNL league that we've talked about before, that one is known to be heavy on the travel. So I think most families will use that as a key indicator of, do I have the means to commit to this kind of travel or not? And I think that's probably a really good example of how you might weigh your options. And then prior to all of those levels, I mean, it was very local, still
Mhm.
even in the Phoenix area, but for example, I remember some weekends we would have to drive to Flagstaff, which was technically in Arizona outside of Phoenix, but you're still traveling within the state, right? So it's 2-hour drive up north and you spend the weekend there for the tournament. So even when you're younger, depending on the club that you choose, that still can involve travel time and again, transportation, logistics, time invested overall. So I think the biggest differentiator of how far you travel is definitely the level of the club team that you're playing on. And like you've said before, if that's not something that either you have the capacity to do or your athlete doesn't want to spend their weekends traveling, then you might consider either a lower level within that same club or just playing for one of the club teams that might not even engage in traveling because I'm very certain that those exist.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point as well of the athlete being okay with that because for me personally, my last 2 years of high school when I was playing academy, we were basically traveling twice a week to California, so we were flying there, and so that's you're missing school on Fridays, and then you're coming back Sunday night, you're playing 2 games while you're there, so it's just all action, and it's a real big time commitment for the athlete as well at that point.
Yeah, so definitely getting clear on goal setting and priorities and even just level of interest with your athlete is
Right,
critical for sure before, even thinking about whether you have the bandwidth or not.
right.
So I think bottom line here is there are several factors that go into how you should weigh how much time you want to spend because obviously location like we mentioned that's going to, no matter what, add in so much more time invested into whatever sport you're choosing if you're far from said club or high school, whatever it is that you're shooting for. So if that's something that's not as easy to do, it probably would be, worth considering either moving closer to that or thinking, well, maybe that's just not in the plans for us, right? So
Right.
location is definitely one.
Yeah, and I think another thing to really factor in is you don't have to start out at the farthest away place that has the most travel and the most trainings. I would kind of suggest to ease into it and sort of build your way into that very high demand 3 to 4 practices a week sort of commitment.
Yeah, I agree. And again, I think what you're hitting at is just whatever your goals are, factor them in. And we talk about this so much, but it's also depending on what your goals are. For our case, our priority maybe wasn't necessarily to get drafted, when we're 15. So we're not going to uproot our parents' lives to go to the highest, most visible club in the nation, and that if that's not your highest priority, then you're probably not going to start out at that club. If that is your highest priority, that's also really great
Mhm.
too, but
Yeah.
you will have to acknowledge the time commitment that may go into that.
Right, exactly. So, like you said, it's just kind of weighing what you really wanna prioritize, and we really wanted to make this episode just so people who are getting to this stage can really get a feel for how much time will need to be committed, and that's not a bad thing or a good thing, it's just a realistic, logical thing.
Yeah, so definitely weighing location, the bandwidth of your family, bandwidth of your athlete even, and then whatever goals you might have in mind as a family and perhaps your athlete as an individual as well.
And that pretty much wraps up our conversation here. We would really like to hear from you guys if you guys have any experiences like this, or if there's anything we kind of brushed on and you want us to go deeper into, we can totally do that.
Yeah, let us know. We always enjoy hearing your stories.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. We'll see you next week.